Bonjour à tous et toutes, et bienvenue à cet événement très spécial. I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous people, including Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous people whose presence marks this territory on which we now gather. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this third edition of McCall MacBain President's Lecture. We are thrilled to have with us our many current McCall MacBain scholars, finalists, and regional awards recipients, along with students and faculty from McGill's Maxwell School of Public Policy, members of the broader McGill community, and McCall MacBain's staff, board, and volunteers. I want to acknowledge something, if you're seeing some hesitation on my part, that I just had an eye surgery recently, and I'm dealing with a little bit of a complication from that. That's why I'm having difficulty keeping my eyes on the lines that I'm supposed to follow. So please bear with me, forgive me for being a little tentative. I would also like to extend my very warm welcome to John McCall MacBain and Marcy McCall MacBain, who are present here. Would you please stand up so everybody can see you? Just please, please. Not that you need any introduction. Your vision and generosity have not only made this event possible, but you have also helped strengthen McGill's capacity for knowledge mobilization and dialogue. And this is what we're doing today. We're deeply grateful for your support. Events such as this are integral to advancing McGill's mission. In today's society, universities have a critical responsibility to uphold truth, challenge assumptions, and create the conditions for ideas to be examined openly and rigorously. In a time marked by disinformation, divisive rhetoric, and widening political fault lines, fostering informed dialogue is not only important, it is essential to sustaining a thriving democracy. This mission has taken on newfound urgency given the shifting and increasingly complex dynamics of the Canada-US relationship. These circumstances make today's discussion not only incredibly relevant, but essential. Helping bring clarity to this evolving situation are our two esteemed speakers today, Ms. Jennifer Ditchburn and Professor Pearl Eliadis. As President and CEO of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, Jennifer Ditchburn is a leading voice in making complex policy issues more accessible to all Canadians. A seasoned journalist, Ms. Ditchburn spent 2 decades covering national and parliamentary affairs for the Canadian Press and CBC Television, earning 3 national newspaper awards and the prestigious Charles Lynch Award for outstanding coverage of national issues. From 2016 to 2021, she also served as editor-in-chief of the influential digital magazine Policy Options. Ms. Ditchburn is a fellow of Carleton University's Political Management Program, a board member of the Banff Forum, and co-editor of the 2016 book, The Harper Factor, Assessing a Prime Minister's Policy Legacy. With her deep expertise and commitment to advancing public discourse, I could not be more thrilled that she has agreed to join us here today. Merci à Madame Ditchburn d'être de nôtre aujourd'hui. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir. Joining her in conversation is Professor Pearl Eliadis, hiding behind this pillar, from me at least. Professor Eliadis is an associate professor at McGill's Maxwell School of Public Policy and Faculty of Law. A practicing human rights lawyer, Professor Eliadis has worked as a senior consultant to the UN, leading global projects on democratic governance. In Canada, She has over a decade of experience in the public sector, including as member of the Advisory Council to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. She currently serves on the expert committee of the Court Challenges Program and on the Quebec Bar Association's expert group on human rights. Professor Eliadis is a recipient of numerous awards, including the Excellence in Human Rights Award from Atlantic Human Rights Center. Notre université et nos étudiants sont privilégiés de pouvoir compter sur l'expérience et expertise de la professeure Eliadis. Merci de votre participation aujourd'hui. It is now my pleasure to open the floor to our distinguished speakers. Thank you all for joining us here today, and I hope you enjoy what promises to be a fascinating conversation. Merci beaucoup et bon après-midi.
I'm going to do this because I know that we're going to need it, right, Pearl?
Yes, we will. So thank you so much to everyone for coming. Jennifer, thank you for the water.
Yeah.
So what an incredibly opportune and timely moment to have this conversation. There was a saying we were just talking about before we started that I've heard the Halifax version and the Texas version. One of them is, if you don't like the weather now, wait 5 minutes. If you don't like what Trump is saying right now, wait 5 minutes. The current climate is obviously disturbing for many. A recent Abacus poll indicated that 75% of Canadians, it may have been 76, are less anxious and concerned about are very anxious and concerned about the Trump administration, what's happening in the United States. And there's, of course, a significant and obvious impact on our social and political and economic landscapes in Canada. And I can think of nobody better placed than Jennifer to be in conversation with on this. And before I turn it over to the first question, I just wanted to do a version of Keep Calm and Carry On, which is that, you know, we've actually seen this before. These types of things are not unprecedented, and being Greek, if you will forgive me my big fat Greek family wedding version at a university, Thucydides, 416 BCE, during the Melian dialogues, which involved an attack by Athens that wanted both tribute and complete surrender from the Melians. They said, "What is your quarrel with us? We are the labradoodle of Hellenic civilizations. We have no quarrel with you." And the Athenians said, "We don't care, we're invading you, give it up. We are going to have complete domination." And the Melians said, "But what about equity? What about fairness? What about justice?" And the Athenians responded with a very famous line, which is, "The powerful do what they can and the weak do what they must." And I think we're very much in a similar moment now in terms of some of the dialogue and discourse that we've had before, including more recently and closer to our time, some of the comments from our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who noted last week that the era of close and deepening ties with the US is over. A comment that reverberated right across the world. So, Jennifer, to start us off, I'm interested in your thinking and your institute's thinking about what has really changed. What were the trends up until this point in time, and how have they really shifted? What do we need to be paying attention to right now?
Thank you. And thank you to McGill and to John and Marcy and the McCall MacBain Scholars for inviting me. I'm really touched that you thought of me to be a speaker. Let me just start by sharing a reflection, and I'll get in a kind of circuitous route to an answer. I've been thinking a lot about how upset we are about what's happening with the United States and where that sense of outrage comes from. And I was thinking about the sort of microcosm of my own family and my family history. So you might know that we are almost at the 80-year anniversary of VE Day. in May of this year. And I'm thinking a lot about my grandfather, who was a prisoner of war in Germany and for 2 years. And, you know, it was Americans who showed up at the gates of Stalag Luft 3 to try to liberate the prisoners of war. They weren't able to do that. It's a long story, how he didn't get home right away. But at any rate, that feeling of deep connection to the United States, there's a reason for it, right? And I think about, you know, another side of my father's family from here in Montreal, were Jews who immigrated, among the first Jews that immigrated to Montreal in the late 1800s, and lived their life on both sides of the border. So, you know, we have like this deep family connection to and I think a lot of Canadians do. Then I think about my mother's family, and they're from Guatemala. I think you know where I'm going to go with this. But at the same time as we were coming out of the war period, and the period we think of as this great era of 80 years of stability, Bretton Woods system, all of that, you know, for people in my mother's family, this is a time where the US was involved in a propaganda campaign to unseat a democratically elected president. And I'm sure the very educated scholars in this room know a history of what happened in Chile and Nicaragua and other places in Latin America. So we have this interesting lens, you know, sitting where we are in Canada, of what the United States does. And we see it as a, you know, benevolent force. But I think the bottom line, and it kind of goes to your Mullion dialogues, is that the United States is going to do what's good for them and what's good for its people. And sometimes there are countries that you know, are getting in the way or are vulnerable to that situation. And we have to remember too, like, it's easy in this stage at 2025 to think this relationship has been wonderful and so on, but we had bumps in the road. I mean, there was the era of Diefenbaker and Kennedy, and the struggle over putting nuclear warheads in Canada, that led to, you know, some really bad times in the Canadian-U.S. relationship not all that long ago. So, you know, my point is that we've seen this movie before. It depends on your perspective about it. But in terms of the trends that are leading us here, we were also preparing before Trump for movements that were happening inside the United States. So under the Biden administration, Biden was spending trillions of dollars through the Inflation Reduction Act. And as Canadian policy makers and decision makers, we're thinking about how do we address this, you know, giant sucking sound of investment that the IRA was making into the United States. So we're already having a reflection on how to deal with that. Also, Buy American laws and policies inside the United States that were affecting procurement and hurting Canada. And that was under a Democratic government in the US. So it wasn't as if the picture was super, super, super rosy before Trump arrived. But here we are. There's no question that he's upending a global order and a trade order. And there's a lot of, you know, a lot of big conversations happening about how we're going to reorient ourselves going forward. In Canada, and I have this conversation internally with my team, is that what Trump has done, there's a silver lining, and that is that he has put so much pressure on us as a country that we're finally focused on getting things done that we haven't been able to get done in a long time, because of the sort of natural inertia that happens when you have, you know, 24 major policy things to do and you can't figure out which ones to prioritize. Well, now it's pretty clear what you need to prioritize. So dismantling interprovincial trade barriers, we need to figure out how to diversify our export markets, deal with our major infrastructure needs in this country. I'm reading here because there's so many, I'm going to forget some. Simplifying our approvals process for major projects, and sorting out the recognition of foreign credentials for workers that are coming in. These are just a few of the things that I feel that we're at a moment that we could, if we actually seize this moment that Trump has given us, I mean, it's not great that we're in this situation, but that we could actually move forward on a number of key policy issues. And so as a think tank, you know, I've never seen a better window of opportunity for us to impact public policy, provide decision makers and politicians with data and analysis that they can use and actually move the puck forward on some of these things. That's a long-winded answer. Sorry, Pearl.
It was great. So I'd like to pick up on this moment of optimism because I do feel like we need more of this right now. And my colleague Vincent Rigby, who's here in the room somewhere, has one of Canada's leading experts on national security, has been talking about the opportunities that the current crisis offers for getting our borders sorted out and really making sure that we're addressing Canada's sovereignty and our nationhood, if you will, in a way that serves our future and serves Canadians. I'd like to maybe focus this conversation and this idea of optimism a bit more on communities in Canada. And obviously there's a lot of concern about what the impacts, the economic impacts are in this country, what the impacts are on trust in our governance structures. What are your thoughts on how we empower communities and how we think about the current opportunity as a place where we can help to build rather than take things apart?
Well, we've been doing research at the Institute for over 2 years now, and it's interesting because when we started it wasn't with the mindset of tariffs and Trump. We were doing research on which communities in Canada were most exposed in terms of the energy transition. So as an organization, we accept that climate change is happening, and we accept that there's a global energy transition. Now, that energy transition can be slowed down. It could be accelerated depending on who's in power, but it's going to happen. I mean, when you look at the projected impact on GDP of the increasing climate events that we have, we will reach a point where we'll have to make accelerated changes to the energy mix that we have. So with that in mind, we wanted to know which communities in Canada were most susceptible to disruption because of the global energy transition. Because we forget about people when we talk about tariffs and when we talk about big things like climate action and the energy transition. We forget there's people living in those places that are feeling these things acutely. And when you think about some of the polarization and the feelings of resentment that you see in the US and parts of Canada related to globalization, a lot of it stems from that same problem where not enough attention was paid to the incredible disruption to workforces and people at the community level. So we set aside, which was basically a data project to overlay different data sets. And by the way, it was a Max Bell student who is now a research director at the Institute, who has been the key person behind this project, or one of the key people behind this project, to create a map of Canada based on census division and look at which communities are most susceptible. And we found 10% of Canadians live in communities that are susceptible to some kind of workforce disruption because of things that are happening. Their coal plant is closing. The coal mine is closing. In the case of Ingersoll, their big GM plant has transitioned to a different kind of plant. And not all disruptions mean job loss. Sometimes the disruption is that you need different kinds of workers, and the ones you have are suddenly not equipped for what they need to do. So now we're in a tariff situation. And sorry, I should back up and tell you that most of the communities are remote, they're rural, and they're not very economically diverse. So now you're looking at a tariff situation, and in the last few months, Ricardo Chefek, who's our research director that's been doing a lot of work on this, he used the same architecture and methodology, and took a long time to build this methodology, to see what the impact of tariffs was going to be. And some of the same communities, not in all cases, but a lot of times, your lack of economic diversity in your town, where you're placed, can make you that much more vulnerable to what's going on. okay, and so why do we care? Like, why do we need to know where those places are? It's because to design policy, you need to know who you're designing the policy for, who you're trying to help, and what tools you have at your disposal that will help those people the most. This is a project that's ongoing. But one of the key messages that we had for the federal government is, the people who work in community economic development, people who work in Ingersoll and Estevan, Saskatchewan, and in Sydney and Cape Breton and so on, they know. I traveled to some of these communities, and when you ask them, they'll tell you, oh, there's this huge opportunity for new farming in this part of our census, our community, or there's a new ski hill they could reopen that would bring in tons of tourists, but we can't seem to connect the dots on the investment. So they know where the opportunities lie, and it might seem weird, but they're also super optimistic often when you talk to people about what things that could be developed in their communities. But so our recommendation for government was to channel more resources into those people that work at the community level. And also look at the overall skills picture. I'm giving you like a couple of points on this, but also to look at how we can help reskill people for different kinds of jobs, and how they can get some of the credentials that they need from local colleges and universities in a more effective way, so that we can seize the opportunities that we have that will help make us more resilient against not just tariffs, but also the global energy transition. It's a poly situation. I don't want to say crisis, but we're looking at multiple things that are affecting us at a local level.
Polycentric challenges.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So I'd like to pick up on the "it's not just tariffs" part of your last observation. Obviously, we're all fixated on the economics of this, on the tariffs, on how they're mostly unprecedented since the 1930s, I want to say, in terms of the United States, and what Gillian Tett from the Financial Post has called the mercantilism of the United States, going back to sort of Renaissance and imperial area theories of how one dominates countries and this idea of hegemony. And so I'd like to shift that conversation to what's happening with the media in terms of their ability to report on this. What is happening to the media in Canada, the United States? What's happening to the justice system? And how those two might be connected in terms of the messages that are going to Canadians and to Americans as well, thinking about who we are, our trust in government, and who we think about as our own how we think about our own national identity.
Well, I'm obviously very concerned about the health of our media environment in Canada, and for different reasons, it's critically important that we keep it strong, because it helps protect other institutions within our system by acting as a watchdog, but also by informing people about why those institutions are important. But I find it's interesting what's happening in the United States in terms of what could be kind of coming across the border, and where we could be concerned about a kind of contagion with what's happening there in terms of the courts. And you and I were talking earlier about the Supreme Court decision on the deportee from El Salvador. So on a surface level, we might not see that there's an immediate impact on us of what's happening in the US too, whether it's the media or the courts or so on. But there are sort of indirect effects that I think are coming across the border. So in one case, I think that there's been a direct impact on us in terms of how we talk about things like equity and inclusion in this country. So we've had, you've seen in the US a state backlash against talking about anything to do with racism or discrimination or equity and inclusion. And the private sector has reacted very quickly. And interestingly enough, that's also happened here. You've seen some kind of walking back after, 3 years on the idea that these are values that we should uphold in Canada. I'm thinking of certain private sector companies. But also I'm thinking of, the Net Zero Banking Alliance and banks that withdrew from that alliance in the United States and have withdrawn from it also in Canada. So there is an impact of what we're seeing in the United States happening here. And then there's other things I think that are very important in terms of cuts to the National Institutes of Health in the United States. It's kind of flown a little bit under the radar, but attacks on data. There's threats to the census again in the US. And a lot of Canadian researchers, and probably some of you in this room know more about this than I do, but the fact that the research that's done across both borders, once the research in the US and the funders are threatened, the projects that are unfolding here in Canada are also under threat. So we simply don't have the resources, the same kind of resources as they do in the US to do some of this fundamental research that we need. So there's a direct impact on what's happening to us here. And just going back to what you were saying about the media and other institutions, I think what we can do now is to double down on safeguarding our institutions. So we're seeing what's happening there, and we're horrified. But it's not like it can't happen here, right? A few years ago, I was at a Canadian Bar Association event, and there were some chief justices and federal court justices that were involved. And the topic they wanted to talk about was fascinating to me, but the topic they wanted to talk about was the fact that no one covered the courts anymore. And you and I talked about this the other day, and you said, well, what about Sean Fine at the Globe, right? And I went and looked it up, and Sean has been replaced by a new reporter. But that reporter at the Globe is basically the only person in Canada who has a full-time beat. Someone's going to prove me wrong on this, but as far as I know, the only one who has a full-time justice beat in Canada. And what happens is that when people don't understand what the courts do and why it's important to be independent, they don't fight for it. I think even 15, 20 years ago when I was working on Parliament Hill, we would go to a Supreme Court briefing and there might be 20 reporters there on a good day for a big decision. And the Supreme Court media people now say they have to call journalists and beg them to come and cover some major decisions. So that really concerns me, is that a kind of civic education that's lost. And when you don't understand why the courts have to be independent, as I said, you're not going to be enraged when it's actually violated. And I think, as I said, the media has an overarching role here to play in educating people. And there are other actors too. So there's our agents of parliament. And we have a parliamentary system, which, thank God, is I think probably more effective in these periods than the U.S. system, in the sense that the official opposition, when they're working at full force, can be very effective at being a watchdog for the other side. Whereas if you look at what's happening in the United States now, it's very diffuse opposition to what Trump's doing. Whereas ours can be really pointed and effective within the arena of the House of Commons.
And if we can just pick up on that point, because I think it's important, getting back to this idea of well, maybe not going back so far as Thucydides, but a little more recently than that, that we do have this system of independent agencies, officers of parliament, agents of parliament, who have been set up structurally with protections through administrative law and statutory independence to do their jobs. And that is everything from the Official Languages Commissioner to the Canadian Human Rights Commission to the Office of the Auditor General, of course, the Nuclear Safety Agency, and so on. And it wasn't all that long ago, during a Harper administration, that we saw, with very few legislative changes, we saw a lot of policy being upended in terms of the independence that these officers and agents and agencies were able to exercise in Canada. We saw direct interference on a much less dramatic scale than the United States, but certainly happening here. My question to you is, given the fact that we've had a mini-me, if you will, history of this in Canada, we do have an election coming up. What are your thoughts on what you called earlier that contagion effect in terms of how governments might see, or a new government might see, the opportunities to reduce opposition, not only politically, but in terms of our own structures in this country?
Well, I have a caution that we can't confuse attacks against democracy and having the natural existence of two visions of what government in Canada should look like. Certainly there were things that happened under the Harper years that you see some mirroring of what's happening in the United States right now. But if I take just the media, which is more my area of expertise, and I've wrote about what happened during the Stephen Harper years, I saw some of those things as a part of a continuum. Justin Trudeau's government did some of the same, had some sort of the same media tactics. And actually there's, some interesting research that could be done on, how the government was able to manage information during the pandemic years, which I think was like a huge loss for the news media environment, in the sense that the government was able to take such control over message during the pandemic because of the shutdown. So I think there, in certain cases and on certain things, there's like an erosion over time, and it can go over parties, and it's not always just straight one party or the other. But again, to go back to, how can we ensure that what's happening in the US to democratic institutions and systems doesn't happen here? We really need a strong public service. And I see Neil there from the Max Bell School, Neil Bauer. And I know Neil would agree with me here, but we need a functional, strong public service with, people who are, well informed on the key issues of the day, and have the right technology at their fingertips. Like that public service. I used to say when I worked on Parliament Hill about the government, whatever government was there, we'll be here. We were here before you, and we will be here after you, and we were. This too shall pass. With some scars, but the public service is even more so. The public service will be there before the next government. It'll be there after this government. So those are the institutions we have to focus on. The judiciary, making sure that we preserve the independence of our court system. You mentioned the agents of parliament, and those are and one thing I want to mention and not to forget about is the upper chamber, which has gone through a huge change in the last number of years, in the last 10 years. The Independent Senators Group, there's some incredible senators doing incredible work and holding governments to account in a way that they haven't since the Senate began. So those, I think, I feel pretty good about our system. It's making Canadians understand why it's important. I think that that's key. And then they put pressure on the politicians to keep those things intact.
So when we talk about what matters to Canadians, and I think that idea of keeping intact what's important is critically significant, not only for this idea of trust in government, but also how we understand our judiciary and the independence of the judiciary that you mentioned earlier. The way in which we understand the importance of the independence of the judiciary in Canada, its role with regard to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, feels very different than some of the discourse that's going on right now in the United States. The Canadian appointment process to the judges that are appointed by the federal government, so from the Section 96 courts and up, it's not the kind of thing necessarily that we're used starting from scratch you would design the way we've designed it in Canada. And it may not always feel incredibly democratic. But then you look at the United States and you look at that polarization and the impact it clearly is having on the judiciary. In terms of the impacts on how we understand public policy and the law, do you have any thoughts on the current environment and what is different about Canada and the way we maybe see the courts that perhaps is different than the United States and might or might not insulate us from some of the divisions and polarization that we're seeing today?
I mean, honestly, it's not, I'll caution, it's not my area of expertise, but I tend to think that the United States, or people in the United States, have maybe a better window into the process than we do. There's a certain opacity around the court process in Canada. Certainly, I have the highest respect for the Supreme Court, but it's not a body where there's much transparency. And I think a reluctance to, with my interaction that I've had with the courts as a journalist in the past, I kind of reflex to keep things close to the vest. And so when that happens and there's not much letting light into the process and so on, I think that people feel more estranged from it. Whereas in the US, for all its flaws, it's all out in the open, right? The process for appointments and how the system works. Now you're much more of an expert on this than me, Pearl, so you might disagree with that, but that we could do with more information about our system and why the system is set up the way that it is. And so I'm always going to be a proponent for civic education along those lines.
Right, and open and public debate about how the appointment processes work, which I think is something that Irwin Cotler, among others, when he was Minister of Justice, tried to open up. I'd like to move, if I may, to the issue of who we are as Canadians, our sense of identity and migration. This has become a sort of linchpin issue in Canada, I think for some very different reasons than it has in the United States. Some people have said, in Canada, that we have a declining interest in or support for immigration. Others have said, well, it's not really that. It's really just to make sure that we have the housing and health infrastructure to accommodate people when we bring them in. So it's not really about a reaction against immigration per se. And then you look at the United States and what's happening with migration, with the deportations you were talking about earlier, and this sense that something different is happening in the United States. I wonder if you could give us your perspective on what's happening, particularly in Canada, and maybe its impact on who we think we are as a country.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Andrew Parkin at Environic Institute, who does really wonderful data research survey work on Canadian public opinion and sentiments. And we partner with him on an annual survey called Confederation of Tomorrow. And his research on sentiment towards immigration is super interesting because he does this research year over year, so he's able to track what's happened. And there was a distinct decline in Canadian sentiment towards immigration, which was alarming for Canadian leaders. But he was very granular about it, and he was able to point out that when you dig into the numbers, that people in Canada are still not anti-immigrant, and they're still not anti-immigration. That there's still a foundation of support for the idea that we're an immigrant nation, but it was a profound sense of disappointment with the system and that the system was not working as it should. And I can tell you that people inside government admit that there was a miscalculation on the impact of a basically unregulated number of international students that came into the country. And on top of that, temporary foreign workers, and then on top of that, an increased number of what you would call regular migrants into the country that added up to about 1 million people a year. 1 million is a lot. And this is not to say, I hope you're not taking this pejorative to any of those groups, but the system as we had it was not, there was not enough corresponding resources put in to absorb that number of people that were coming into the country. Now, to blame certain groups for a housing shortage is patently unfair. But I think that the former government, the Trudeau government, realized that they were putting in peril broad-based support for our system of immigration. Now, what's interesting, Pearl, is that as soon as Mark Miller, the former immigration minister, put in those new limits, there is a chain reaction. It's not without pain, and I'll tell you that when I travel and meet with people, talk about public policy issues, immigration comes up all the time, and not the way you think. It comes up in the context of labor shortages that are not getting any better. So we're now in a deficit. Our population's now in decline, net decline. And also, people in this room will be acutely aware of the impact on higher education. It's a crisis. At the college level, we could see some Canadian colleges close. And then back to what I was talking about earlier about communities. I mean, communities depend so much on community colleges and institutes. Sorry, Deep, I'm talking about community colleges, but the universities have also. The universities in Montreal, English universities in Montreal, are feeling this pain as well. What's happening with immigration levels. But if you take a place like Sault Ste. Marie, I was talking to the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie. They're facing a tariff war. They're facing. They've just changed their processes at the steel plant to electric process versus a coal process. Okay, that's another thing. And their college and their university are in crisis. It's not good, right? So it's it's one of those things. It's a complicated policy question, but the kind of whipsaw hasn't been a great approach to it.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the universities issue, especially given what we're seeing coming out of the current Trump administration in particular, but also its impact on Canadian research projects, which we've been seeing in the news a little bit recently. I'm going to come back to universities in a moment. I just want to have one more sort of kick at the immigration can, so to speak. So 100 years ago, I used to work at the immigration department at the federal government, and one of the things that structurally was happening was that the temporary immigration programs were just hermetically sealed from the permanent immigration programs. And so when the government, and it's not new that Canada's been seeing or forecasting a drop in population and a need for resources. This is not a recent development. When the Trudeau Liberals decided to ramp up the numbers, echoing, I think, less a Liberal tradition more recently, but even what Brian Mulroney did, right, which was one of sort of the historic rises in immigration levels in Canada under the progressive Conservative government. We had this sort of surge, and the government was only counting the permanent immigration numbers. And from what I know from people in the department, they were frantically signaling the centre, saying, what about this 1 million more people? Shouldn't we be counting them? And shouldn't we care about what's happening to them? What do you think Canada should be doing right now in terms of the folks who are here and the issues around community empowerment, housing issues that are not necessarily in federal jurisdiction? How does all get that joined up?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a few, there's one thing I want to highlight, which is that I think there's a policy area that I'm quite keen to dig into as an institute, and that is our feeling of shared citizenship and identity in Canada. And it overlaps with the immigration issue and the idea of settlement because, the pandemic, I think, made it clear that and worsened feelings of like fraying of connection between people. And when those connections between people are eroding, it has a consequence for democracy as well and how much we trust our institutions. And so you'll hear, different voices on this. So, there's one camp will say we need to identify shared values, and people need to take a citizenship oath to say they recognize these shared values. And there's a whole discourse around that, which I'm not j'écarte pas. Like I think there's like a conversation there. But my response to that is, okay, but what are you doing, in your community to make people feel like they are welcome, that they belong? And so what's the policy question there? This is something that I want to investigate further with my team, but I think there are, and we've, our mutual friend Leslie Seidel, who used to work at IRPP, published a book on this, about 15 years ago, but how much we invest in community organizations, how much we invest even in sports organizations, what's the role of churches and synagogues and mosques and temples in terms of like how we connect as communities. Those are really important issues. If you just forget about the tariff question and the economic questions, there are sort of other things that are lurking in the policy space that we can't forget about, and that you raised immigration, but I think there's also an important democratic question about shared citizenship and belonging. And then I'll just say one other thing to focus on would be the recognition of people's skills when they come to Canada, and which is a stubborn issue. So I'm really hoping that this current situation will finally break the back of the foreign credentials issue, which I've been hearing about since I started working as a journalist when I was 24 years old. And it's such a stubborn question. But I'll give you one statistic. How many, I'll ask you, do you have a guess at how many mining job vacancies there are in Canada? 500,000. 500,000 vacancies in mining jobs in Canada. So when you think about the fact that we're talking about tariffs and how we're going to restructure our economy, how are we going to make sure that the people who are here are skilled properly, or are we recognizing their skills that are coming from another country? So everything's interconnected, and I think in terms of the question you asked me, I think those would be two things that I'd watch for. Yeah.
So I was thinking about your point in terms of what's going on with housing. There's apparently a shortage of more than 3 million housing units in this country, something I've been talking about with folks from Max Bell who are here today. And we're hearing from both political, well, I shouldn't say both, all four political parties. The only thing sort of worse than a one-party state is a two-party state. I'm glad we have almost four, depending on how things work out. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that one of the things that the construction industry has been saying is that it's great that we're going to set these new targets. We're going to create these incentives. We're going to create subsidies or incentives for new buildings to be built. But the construction industry is saying we don't have the people. Is it your sense that these ideas of skill-based shortages are clear across the board, or do you think they're focused on a few specific industries?
No, I think there's specific kinds of jobs that we need more people. I'm not going to go too far out on this because my colleagues are better experts on this than I am, but it goes to that idea of having tailored policy to the community where you are, and having industry in a community work with the colleges to identify which skill sets are required for the opportunities that are in those specific spaces. So instead of sort of spreading the peanut butter of like funding across the country to help, you're looking at, okay, where are the opportunities that we have? If you're talking about the housing sector and construction jobs, targeting that for the kinds of workers that you need to address those shortages. And I don't want to gloss over the fact that we have certain groups in Canada that are underemployed. So we have there's a credential issue. Indigenous people are underemployed in this country. And people with disabilities who live with disabilities are underemployed in this country. So there's other areas that we could be tweaking more specifically to help with some of the skills and job shortages.
And I feel like this is such a fantastic segue into the idea of vocational training, universities, what's happening with the university sector, maybe talking a little bit about academic freedom and some of what's been happening in the US, implications for Canada. I was reading this morning about the fact that Canadian programs that are engaged in health research are now being told there are certain words they cannot be using, or certain research directions they cannot be going in if they want to continue to be receiving funds from the U.S. And if you'd allow me one little footnote, somebody who I spent some time with at Max Bell recently, we both work with the UN, and she had just come up from the United Nations in New York, and the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency Unit that is attached to the United Nations in New York, had issued a list of permitted words that American officials are allowed to use in their written communications with the United Nations. And those words are verboten, and they're not allowed to be using them. And they include not only what you might expect in terms of diversity and inclusion and LGBTQ+, and bias, it also includes women. So for those of you who are going to be working on issues involving women anywhere in the United States, please remember a forbidden word. But these kinds of things, I think, have a chilling effect on our conversations, on our communications with government, on our communications between science and the public, and of course the way in which science is developed. How do you see people talking about the university space, learning, research? How has that changed as a result of the recent developments in your view?
The recent developments in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's too early to tell. I mean, I think there's been, some cases of universities in Canada who have moved away from talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And you can find mention of that in the news. It has been very interesting to me to observe over 30 years, what the words that governments use are very powerful. So as an example, during the Harper years, the words gender equality or, talk about carbon pricing or carbon taxes were, they were more or less verboten. And you have a kind of a flip side situation during the Justin Trudeau years in terms of words that were, more commonly used, and, gender-based analysis and so on. But governments have an impact on how the private sector acts. And also what I was referring to before, what is suddenly seen as acceptable dialogue. And so, we went through a period where, it was, I don't know how to put this, but, on point or trendy to talk about discrimination, diversity, equity, inclusion. You certainly wouldn't have a panel discussion without having women on it. That I think was filtered down from what was deemed appropriate by government. And in the same way, I think that because government for the last 10 years has been very focused, and I think this is one thing I would say is something that they should be congratulated on, is that the focus on reconciliation, a partnership with First Nations, that has filtered down into our public discourse in a significant way. Like, I don't think anyone can deny that the sustained focus on that has changed how we talk as a public around those issues. But I would caution against, boxing governments in terms of having a perception of what they are and what they will do based on what language they use and so on. And I often use the example of, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I've used talking to nonprofit groups, but there are certain things that the Harper government brought in that you would associate with a progressive government. So for example, they were behind billions of dollars spent globally on women and maternal health, around the world. That was a Harper government initiative under the Muskoka initiative of G7, and that had a huge impact globally on women's health. The other would be Jim Flaherty having the disability accounts, which have been very significant for families that have people with disabilities that are able to save for when a point at which your parents are no longer living. So there's I kind of try to resist classifying governments, Canadian governments, in terms of their kind of rhetoric, because there are things that they do that don't fit exactly with that.
Right. And we talked about this a little bit in the lead up to this conversation, that there really, in many respects, has been this sort of pan-Canadian consensus, if you will, among different parties in Canada with regard to things like multiculturalism, like human rights, like non-discrimination, that I think it's fair to say have spanned across both, the main parties, of course, who've been in power, the Liberal and the Conservative parties as well. So absolutely worth noting.
I'll just add one other thing.
Yeah, please.
The Ford government in Ontario, I don't know of another provincial government that has this rule, but will not allow you to ask for Canadian experience when you're applying for a provincial job. To me, this is you might not equate that with something that a Conservative government would do, but that just to that point is that I think it's easy to say that this government is this way, but they do things that don't match their language.
So I spent a bit of time in the Ontario Public Service, and the day that I started on August 1st, 1995, was the day the Harris government started. And during that period, there actually was the beginnings of a lot of conversation around preventing Canadian experience from being used as a job criterion, because it is blatantly discriminatory and has a significant impact on new arrivals to Canada. So yeah, your point's absolutely well taken. I'd like to close before we turn it over to questions, which I think we're going to be doing next, to one of my favorite books, which is Timothy Snyder's short book on tyranny, and the top 4 rules that I take out of, I think he has 10 or 12 or 14. Anyway, my top 4 rules are: do not obey in advance, defend institutions, which I think comes very strongly out of our conversation today, believe in truth, and be calm when the unthinkable strikes. Any closing thoughts on any of those?
Yes. So I'm obviously thinking about this a lot as a head of a think tank. What is our role? And I know Andre is connected with Public Policy Forum as well, and there's people in the room, McCall MacBain Scholars and Foundation, the university sector. We have a role in this moment, right? We, as a think tank, I feel like it's our obligation now, it's sort of all hands on deck. Let's put the best data and analysis and help find solutions for our Canadian governments, so that they can meet this moment. And you're our critical minerals in this room, right? The human capital students that are going to go on and be the people who are leading the country, working in think tanks, working in private sector. What the scholars are doing, what the universities are doing is critically important, because we're like a stabilizer for the country to make sure that we can get through this really rocky period and out onto the other side. And we have to, it's an important moment for our institutions, because if we let our system erode, or we let the economy drag too much, and we let our standard of living suffer, that is when we're going to see the polarization intensify in the country. And that is when we're going to see radicalization in Canada, is when people feel despondent and they feel that our healthcare, our housing is just eroded so badly. That's when they'll turn to other voices, and they won't lean on the institutions that are there. So I think it's a sort of call to action, but it's for all of us to look at how we can collaborate and put good things out into the world, and also to send the message to the politicians that we need you to collaborate, and the behavior that we expect of you is to reach out across party lines, to think more long term than just in short term phases, and to sort of rise to the occasion as well. And we can do that. You would be surprised at how sensitive that politicians are to what people say to their MPs or their MNAs or their MLAs or MPPs. They do listen when you speak up. So that was a long-winded answer, Pearl, I'm sorry. But
I hope everybody here agrees with me that I don't think we could have had a more insightful glimpse into some of the many difficult and challenging policy issues than Jennifer, and thank you very much for thinking of me for this role today. A hand to Jennifer. Yeah, thanks.